Uh, fair warning for Friday, we'll look at Psalms and Song of Solomon, and Song of Solomon is a very different book, and it's actually very romantic and sometimes even erotic love poetry. And so it's very different than anything else, and for a long time, to the point that it was recommended by a lot of rabbis long time ago that men not even try to read it until they're at least 30 years old, until they're old enough to be fully adult and be married and all those sorts of things, because they didn't want it to tempt them in any way. But it does have a lot of very sensual imagery and sexual imagery, and so if any of that's going to bother you, that might be a lecture to skip and watch the video afterwards. Hopefully that's not going to be any of you, but if that's going to be a trigger for you or anything, do what you got to do. Just giving you your fair warning of what's coming. But today we're going to look at Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job. And we're going to look at these three specifically and going to look at them together because they share some kind of common themes with each other, and they balance each other and give a more complete picture of the things that they are talking about. If you just pull one of them, say Proverbs or Ecclesiastes especially, you may get a distorted view of what the Bible actually says about the meaning of life and how we ought to live life. Or if you just read Job independently, then you'll learn some stuff, but it may also be very confusing. But holding the three together in tension helps you to get a fuller picture of what the Bible says about what the good life looks like, what wisdom looks like, and what the meaning and purpose of life is. So we're going to start with Proverbs. And Proverbs is, just to give you the preview, Proverbs is going to give us a pretty idealistic and clean look at how we ought to live our life and what the consequences of life lived that way should be. And it's basically going to be a relatively clean, if you do right, you get blessings. If you do wrong, you get issues, you get problems. And so good people get good things, bad people get bad things, and that's generally the way the universe works. And so that's kind of what we're going to get from Proverbs. And then from Ecclesiastes, there's a lot more kind of nihilism, or would seem to be nihilism, that everything is meaningless is the English translation, that life is meaningless, that all these things that people pursue for meaning and purpose end up failing them in the end, and that everybody dies anyway, and so what difference does it make? Lots of warm and fuzzy stuff. By the time you get to the end of Ecclesiastes, you're probably at least a little bit depressed. And then Job is a really good guy that has all these really terrible things happen to him, and then most of the book is actually spent in him grieving his bad situation, his lot in life, and also defending himself against the accusations of his friends who think that because he has suffered all these bad things, he must have done something wrong. He must have sinned against God in order to deserve it.
Is that where Satan is trying to test his faith?
Yeah, we will get into the Satan along the way, and when we get to Job. And so these are the three books, and then let's figure out how more details about what's in them, and then figure out how they interrelate to get a bigger, better picture of the real world. So Proverbs. Proverbs is relatively well known by most people because it's the biggest chunk of it at least is a bunch of really short sayings. There's hundreds of these really short, kind of one sentence, 2-line sayings that give general wisdom for life and how to live life well. And that's what most people know from the book of Proverbs, is those really short sayings that are just generally kind of good advice and good wisdom. But that's not the entirety of the book of Proverbs. In fact, that is mostly chapters 10 through 29, and then we have chapters 1 through 9 at the front end, and then we have chapters 30 and 31 at the back end that do something else and that are helpful for understanding, getting this total picture of what Proverbs presents as the wisdom and the way the universe works. And so in chapters 1 through 10, we get a series of, or chapters 1 through 9, sorry, we get a series of speeches, 10 of which are speeches from a father to a son trying to pass on good wisdom, giving good advice to his son. And so there's a lot of advice and wisdom in there about how to live life, and how to choose your friends is actually one of the first, that if you follow the bad company, bad results are going to come from it. Marrying well and living life well. And interspersed with this 10 speeches from a father to a son preparing him for life, there are 4 speeches from Lady Wisdom. And Lady Wisdom is this embodiment of wisdom. It's wisdom personified. Just the concept, the idea of wisdom given a voice. And so it's personified as a woman that gives these speeches and teaches people how to pursue and how to find wisdom. And from these speeches from Lady Wisdom, we get these concepts, these ideas about what wisdom really is. And so one thing is that wisdom is not just a bunch of information that you gather, a bunch of facts that you gather that you know about life. Wisdom is actually an aspect of God's character. God is wise, and so real wisdom reflects God's character. It's an aspect of who God is, a quality of God's character. And because of that, because it is a quality of God's character, it is also a quality of the world that God has made. And so the world has been created according to these principles of wisdom. And so there is a kind of pattern to life. And I compare it to like the graining in wood. I do some amateurish woodworking as a hobby. I built my kid's crib and some other stuff over time. And one of the things that you have to know and be careful with when you're working with wood is the grain direction. There's a particular direction that wood grows because it's a tree. It grows straight up and down, and so there's these long, straight fibers throughout a tree that give it its rigidity and structure. And then when you cut that down and turn it into lumber, those long, straight fibers make a grain. And if you're going to make anything out of that wood, you have to pay attention to the direction that grain goes. Because when you cut along the grain or you carve or shape along the grain, it's generally much easier and you get a much smoother, better looking output. What you get turns out better when you work along the grain. And then there's times that you have to work against the grain. Sometimes you have to cut against the grain because you need it to be, this long. And so you have to cut against the grain from time to time, and you have to work against the grain from time to time, but the results are usually much rougher, and you have to be much slower and much more careful with it to get any kind of good result. And the end result is not going to be as good as working with the grain. And so basically the idea of Proverbs is that because wisdom is an aspect of God's character and therefore is built into the structure of the universe, these cause and effect relationships are part of the universe, then living according to wisdom is like working with the grain of the universe. It's like doing that woodworking and working along the grain instead of against it. If you work along the grain of the universe, if you work according to wisdom's principles, the principles of wisdom, you will generally be working along the paths or the way that the universe is meant to work, and so things will generally be easier for you and turn out better. Things will generally work out better for you if you live according to these principles of wisdom. And if you work against these principles of wisdom, if you are foolish, then you will not get those benefits. In fact, your life will get a lot more complicated, a lot more difficult, and you'll probably experience some disaster. And so life just works out better. Life goes better for you if you live according to these principles of wisdom. And not only is, that life turns out better this way, but wisdom is not, as I said, it's not just some facts that you learn. It's an aspect, or it's a quality of God's character and therefore of the world that God has made. But also, because it's not just facts that you learn, it's also not as simple as getting a whole bunch of stuff into your head. That's not what wisdom is. In fact, the word that's translated as wisdom is also used of craftsmen in the Old Testament. And so it's used these craftsmen that are skilled in all kinds of crafts. They are described as by this word that gets translated as wisdom. And so another key idea or core idea is that wisdom is not just a bunch of facts that you learn and apply. It is a skill that you develop. You learn to become wise by practicing, by doing. You get better at doing things. You get better at living according to wisdom by following these principles, by learning to do it. And so if you follow the principles that you find in the Proverbs and in the larger stretch of Proverbs, you will develop the skill of living according to wisdom, and life will turn out better for you. And so the way to wisdom and the way to the good life is by living according to wisdom. And so, and one of the first steps, or the first step in that, is learning to pay attention to who God is and to learn wisdom from God. And so that's why Proverbs famously says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. The way that you get onto the path of wisdom initially, the kind of first step in wisdom, is recognizing the God that created the universe that you're trying to live well in, and recognize that character and live in reverence and awe of God. And then we have chapters 10 through 29, which is a long collection of mostly very short, kind of 2-sentence or 1-sentence, 2-line sayings that are just recognized as good wisdom. And I've got kind of a selection that I've printed out for good measure, but there are literally hundreds of these. And they cover all kinds of different areas of life and different ways of different aspects of life and things that will come up for you at different times. And so there's stuff about marriage and family, living wisely in marriage, and living wisely in relationship to your children, how to parent well, how to go about conducting business well, and managing money correctly and wisely. How to manage relationships with friends, and how to control your tongue is a major, there's a lot of Proverbs that have to do with managing your speech, controlling what you say. And so there's all of these different areas, all these different Proverbs that give all this different wisdom for these different categories or areas of life. And so for example, lazy hands make for poverty, but diligent hands bring wealth. That's from chapter 10, that first chapter of these short sayings. And that's a really obvious kind of one. This is no shocker or surprise. If you don't do work, then you probably aren't going to get paid for work, right? So if you don't do work, you won't make money. But if you work diligently and consistently, and you develop your skills and your crafts, and you work well and consistently, you'll have more than if you didn't, right? Man, they're gonna make this difficult, aren't they? So generally, that it's just, there you go. You can see that's kind of a wise saying. It's a pattern of life. If you work consistently, diligently, and with skill, you will be wealthy. And if you don't do those things, if you're lazy, then you won't get anything. You'll be poor. But then on the other hand, it's better to be a nobody and yet have a servant than to pretend to be somebody and have no food. And so it is better to be, have no reputation, to be totally unknown, to be forgotten by everybody, and yet have these advantages, like having a servant, affording to pay somebody to help you, to pay a servant, than to present yourself as somebody big and important, to pursue this reputation and not even be able to eat because you spent everything you could get on bolstering your reputation. Better to, this is always a favorite, better to live on the corner of the roof than to share a house with a quarrelsome wife or spouse. Better to live way away and by yourself and with nothing than to have a whole house and always be fighting internally, to always have to be fighting. So work for peace in your own home. The rich and the poor have this in common: the Lord is the maker of them all. Then ultimately there's no difference in value or personhood between the rich and the poor. God created both. And this one is probably going to strike as especially ironic for all of you that have student loans to be here: the rich rule over the poor, and the borrower is slave to the lender. Most of you probably have some student loans to be here, but as a general rule, it's a bad idea to take out loans. Most things that you have to borrow for are not worth it, apart from education and home, I would say. So that's the kind of structure or pattern that there's all of these wise sayings that cover all of these different areas of life, and there are hundreds of them. They're well worth reading and reflecting on. And I think a lot of people are advised, a lot of pastors advise reading like a chapter a day with Proverbs, and that's better than not reading them. But I would say that that's not the best way to read them. The best way to read them is to read 2 or 3 at a time and then stop and just think, reflect on them. Think about how they apply, because some of them seem really straightforward and obvious, and then you start thinking about the way that they apply, and you figure out that you're not actually doing this really straightforward, obvious thing. There's all of these areas of your life that you're not living that way according to. And then there's others that are counterintuitive, that seem really backwards, that seem like they don't make sense. And then when you slow down and you start thinking about them, you realize that there is actually some wisdom in there, and if you live according to that, you'll be living wisely in a culture that lives foolishly in this area. And so it's the cultural norm that is foolish and the proverb that is wise. And so read just a handful at a time and reflect on them rather than trying to read a whole chapter at a time. My suggestion anyway. And so that's chapters 10 through 29. There is a short section in that section in 22 through part of 24 that are kind of longer proverb sayings, the sayings of the wise, and there's several verses to each one, but generally the whole section is just random disconnected proverbs. There's not like one theme that flows through them or sections that you can divide out according to theme. They just all are kind of scattered wise sayings. And then we have in chapter 30, we have this guy named Agur that is presented as a kind of ideal listener to the book of Proverbs. He's somebody that is not especially well educated or has not spent a lot of time thinking about wisdom, but now he is motivated and he wants to learn to become wise. And so he reads these wise sayings and he reflects on them and he thinks about what wisdom is, and he comes to fear God and to live a good life and to receive good results. And so chapter 30, we see kind of a prototypical wise reader of Proverbs. And so we should read like Agur. And then in chapter 31, we started with these 10 father-son speeches that are like a father speaking to his son, teaching him how to live a wise life and passing down his wisdom. And then chapter 31, we get a mother's wisdom. So we got father's wisdom in the first several chapters, and now we get a mother's wisdom given to her son. And there's a king named Lemuel, and he is being given this advice, this wisdom from his mother. And the first chunk of it is just generally good wisdom and advice for leading people well, because he's king. And then the last part of it is an acrostic poem describing the woman of noble character, or the wife of noble character, depending on translation. And so you can see it either as the mother giving his son advice on what to look for in a good wife, or as being the kind of concluding mirror image of Agur in the previous chapter, where we're getting now, we've seen the male ideal listener, and now we're getting the female ideal listener and seeing the outcome of living a good life, a wise life in a woman. And it's an acrostic poem, as I said, which means that each verse of the poem begins with a different letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And so you have basically the kind of ABC, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, so on. So that's the description, and you get this description of this ideal or virtuous woman, a woman that lives according to wisdom. And that is Proverbs. Now, one thing that you should note in this is that Proverbs are not intended to be promises or prophecies. It's not that if you do X, you shall get Y. It's describing regular patterns in the universe, the way that God has arranged the world to work, and if you live according to wisdom, you will generally get good things. Life will generally turn out well for you, but it's not a guarantee that if you do the things of wisdom in every case, you're going to get this outcome. And in fact, that tension is part of what leads us then to turn to Ecclesiastes, which is the next book in the Old Testament. Because then we get to the end of Proverbs, and you might ask, or if you aren't asking now, you probably will at some point in life, why is it that we see people that seem to do the right thing, or they tend to live according to seemingly wise principles, and yet life doesn't seem to turn out great for them? Things happen that are still tragic and painful and difficult for them. So why is it that this stuff happens? And being, trying to encourage careful study and reading, let me say that we tend to think that we are acting wisely and living well when we may not actually be. For example, I have been where y'all are, a few times. I'm trying to count up quickly how many semesters I have been in school after high school. So it's 15. I took 15 semesters of college and graduate level classes. And so 15 times I have been in the last week of class coming up on finals week. And some of you are, at some point in the next week, going to realize that you have made a massive mistake or that everything has gone terribly wrong. You're way behind, papers are due, and you're going to cry out at some point, "Oh God, why is this happening to me?" And you'll feel like the whole universe is unjust. But if we took a careful look at your calendar and your schedule for the rest of the semester, the whole semester, we would probably find that your last week of panic and misery is very much related to the unwise use of your time during the rest of the semester. This is not an, "Oh God, why is this happening to me" kind of moment. This is a, "Oh, that's why this is happening to me" moment. The wisdom of Proverbs is still working. You did not live according to wisdom for a while, and now here's the result, right? And I say this fully recognizing that I was that student that twiddled my thumbs too much during the semester and then panicked in the last 2 weeks. I still passed, but recognizing that's how that went for me quite often. And so that is not an example of the wisdom of Proverbs or the pattern that Proverbs describes failing. That is actually the pattern of Proverbs working out. But then there's sometimes that doesn't hold true. Somebody actually does live according, generally, and for the most part, according to the pattern of wisdom that Proverbs would subscribe, and yet they don't get the great reward. Something happens. Life takes a weird turn. Somebody else interferes. Just luck is against them, and they don't get the good reward. They get something else instead. They get a tragedy, or somebody that just kind of twiddles their thumbs and doesn't really do anything according to wisdom, goes in and buys a lottery ticket and is a millionaire, right? And so life doesn't always work out according to this pattern. And so what do we make of that? How are we supposed to understand that? If Proverbs is true, and this pattern of wisdom is there in the universe and God prescribes it, why doesn't it always work out? And so we're going to get some of that answer from Ecclesiastes. And Ecclesiastes is, it's important to recognize that the book is written by an anonymous person, and then within most of the contents of the book are that anonymous person telling us about the teachings of a character called the teacher, who is described as a son of David, king in Jerusalem. And so the Kohelet is how that is translated, this teacher. The Kohelet is possibly supposed to be Solomon, which means that the contents of Ecclesiastes might actually be the works of Solomon or the work of Solomon condensed down or distilled, or it may actually be something that Solomon wrote. Or it could be the author creating a character that is supposed to be like Solomon, or that is communicating the wisdom of Solomon. But either way, it's important to know whatever you think about who the Kohelet, the teacher, is supposed to be, or where their material comes from. It's important to note that teacher, the Solomon figure that is most of the material in Ecclesiastes is coming from, that material is actually being communicated by an anonymous author who is going to comment on all of that at the very end. And so the first verse of the book gives us this introduction to the Kohelet, the teacher, the Solomon-like figure, and then we'll get about 12 chapters of the material from the teacher, and then we'll get 6 verses at the very end commenting on everything that the teacher has just said, and the author is giving us that kind of final conclusion. And so the book of Ecclesiastes, the teacher's words, after the teacher is introduced, the teacher's words are, in English, meaningless, utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. So there you go. There's your meaning of life. Go home and enjoy, I guess. Ecclesiastes has a kind of reputation of being a real downer, and it kind of is. I mean, there's a lot in Ecclesiastes that is very challenging and even kind of depressing if you're not careful in how you read it and understand it. And a big part of that is because of this word meaningless that keeps showing up. Everything is meaningless. Life is meaningless. It's utterly meaningless. Meaningless, meaningless, meaningless. But that's a misleading translation. Not necessarily a bad translation, it's just that there's not a really good equivalent in English that communicates the same thing, and so they go with something that's going to communicate something like it, but it's also not communicating the meaning clearly. It's a misleading translation. The word that gets translated meaningless is the Hebrew word hevel, which generally it means not something that is meaningless, but something that is formless or smoke-like or enigmatic, difficult to grasp or understand. It's an enigma, a mystery. And so when the teacher says that life is meaningless or that everything is meaningless, when you read that, it's actually not that it has no meaning, it's that it is difficult to grasp, or that it is in flux or dynamic and changing. It's like smoke. And so think it is smoke-like. You can see smoke coming up from a fire. It looks like something solid that you can go and grab a hold of. But if you go and try to grab a hold of it, you'll find that your hands are really empty. There's nothing there. There's nothing to grab a hold of. Life and the meaning of life, the purpose of life is like that. There are patterns that you can see. There's something clearly that you can see there. But then if you go and try to hold on to and grab and claim as your promise, the way things are going to be, if you try to take something from Proverbs and say, this is my promise, I'm going to get this, then later you'll open your hands and find that there's nothing there. You may find that things didn't work out the way you expected. Life is vaporous, smoke-like. You can see the patterns, but if you go and try to hold on to it and hold it still, you'll find that it never works. Nothing ever happens like that, or works like that. And so the teacher is going to go and explore several different experiences he's had and things that he has considered that people generally try to build a life around, that they try to ascribe meaning to their life from. And he's going to explore several different things. Amongst them, he'll first talk about pleasure, which probably should be better translated or understood as happiness. Not just physical pleasures, which is how we tend to use the word pleasure, but the things which generally bring kind of happiness and contentment in life. And so, a good vacation, or lots of good food, parties with friends, romance, sexual relationships, all those things that tend to bring pleasure, but not just momentary pleasure or physical enjoyment, but contentment and happiness. So all these things, are those things the things that bring meaning or give meaning and purpose to life? Should we be hedonists? Is the Kohelet going to be hedonistic? And he'll say no. He'll get to the end of his description of the life of pleasure that he pursued, and laughter. He said laughter is madness, which is always bright and cheerful. I tried cheering myself with wine and embracing folly, and I denied myself nothing that my eyes desired. I had servants and slaves. I had groves of trees and amassed silver and gold for myself, and bought everything that I wanted, and even had a harem, which would be kind of all on the Solomon line. All of these things I acquired for myself. I denied myself none of these pleasures, and yet, at the end, when I surveyed all that my hands had done and all that I had achieved and acquired, everything was meaningless, hevel, a chasing after the wind, and nothing was gained under the sun. So pleasure didn't work out for him. Okay, so what else can we try? How about wisdom and understanding, learning, education, wisdom? And ultimately, he says, No, that doesn't produce any kind of lasting meaning. I saw that wisdom is better than folly, just as light is better than darkness. The wise have eyes in their heads while the fool walks in darkness, but I came to realize that the same fate overtakes them both. They both die, and they both end up in the grave. And even before that, sometimes the wise gets what the fool deserves, and the fool gets what the wise deserves. And so these things don't work out the way that you might expect. And so what about work, career, the work of your hands? Can that give meaning to life? Can that be the thing that a person builds their life around? And ultimately he says no, because with wealth, or with work and career, you never know whether your work is going to be appreciated after you're gone, or even while you're still alive. You never know how somebody else is going to use the work of your hands when you're done with it. And if you build up great wealth and you pass down these skills or this wealth to your children, you never know whether they're going to appreciate it, whether the next generation is going to do anything with it or recognize any of your good work, or whether it's all just going to end up being used for stuff that you would hate and that you would think was pointless and meaningless. And what about family, marriage? Ultimately, no, we can't get meaning even from those things, even from family and marriage. We can't build our lives around doing those things, right? Expecting them to fulfill us. Because again, our children may let us down. Our children may not maintain our intentions, and going forward, they may not live the way that we expect them to or want them to. And so they may ruin our dynasty or ruin our legacy that we want to leave behind. And so none of these things end up, and these are the most common things that people want to build a life around, none of these things end up producing lasting meaning or joy or purpose. And a lot of the reason that they don't do it is because they keep running up against reality and these three great equalizers that the author of Ecclesiastes is going to tell us about. And so first we have time, and then death, and then chance. And so time, it says, human beings live for an incredibly short amount of time relative to the world, the earth. Go and look at the mountains. How long have the mountains been there? How many empires have they seen rise and fall, much less the lives of individual people? Go and do your best and build up this great life, and then go tell the mountains about it and see if they care. The life of a human being is just a short speck on the life of the whole earth, much less the life of the whole universe. And so ultimately we all get such a short amount of time to do anything that none of these things can build a purpose or a meaning. And death, we all die. The rich and the poor, the strong and the weak, the wise and the foolish, all alike die. Their final fate is all the same. They all go to the grave. And so what difference ultimately can these things make? And finally, there's just chance, luck. Just sometimes things don't go according to the pattern. You get the fool, the lazy person that wins the lottery and becomes a millionaire, and then you have the shrewd businessman that is wise in his business dealings and fair and good to his employees, and then a disaster happens and wipes out his entire business, and he ends up on the street. And so chance can ruin the best laid plans for anybody. And so you can't guarantee that any of these things are going to produce the good life or the good outcome that you've been hoping for, the hope that you put in it. And so, yeah, none of these things are trustworthy. You can't build a life around them. These things are going to equalize whatever you do. And so, hell, everything is hell. Now, this is really depressing, but this is not where the Kohelet, the teacher, actually leaves you. Because all along the way, I've kind of skipped them for effect, but all along the way, he does point you to things that are valuable, that are genuinely the gift of God, that God gives to his people, that God gives people for their enjoyment, and that they can find happiness and contentment in. And so these things, they don't do it, but there are some things that God gives as a good gift, and they generally tend to be, instead of the long-term plan of doing marriage and family well, or pursuing pleasure and happiness as a goal in life or pursuit in life, just accepting in the moment what God gives as a good gift. And so instead of making marriage and family your life's ambition and building your whole life around it, enjoy the dinner that you get to have with your kids at night. Enjoy a good meal with your family. And to just accept that moment given by God as a good gift. And don't try to build an entire meaning of life out of it. Just accept it. Accept basically that life is vaporous and smoke-like. And instead of trying to latch onto any part of it and hold it still and make it your own, accept that it is smoke-like, and if you try to grasp, you're going to catch nothing. And enjoy the moments as they come. Or as another example, enjoy a good conversation with friends, or seeing the sunrise, or the majesty of a storm. Accept those moments of transcendence and beauty and give thanks to God for them. These are God's gifts to us. Instead of trying to manage and coordinate and build the whole shape of our lives, just accept these moments as God gives them. And generally, as the teacher says, wisdom is better than folly. Live according to the principles of wisdom. Things will go better for you if you do that. Live according to wisdom, but don't expect the patterns of wisdom to give you the good life. Instead, live according to the patterns of wisdom and then trust God with whatever comes, one way or another. And then the author gives his kind of final conclusion in the last few verses. And one line in this is especially for you guys at the very end of the semester. I'm really glad that it works out this way, teaching at the end of the semester, because you'll especially appreciate it now. He likens the words of the teacher of the Kohelet, and he describes them as being like a goad, which was a stick that somebody would use to force an oxen to keep moving along the right path, or used to goad sheep back into the area they're supposed to be in. And then he also likens the words of the Kohelet as being like a tool that a shepherd uses to guide the flock. And so the teacher is like a shepherd trying to shepherd you into a good path. And so the words of the teacher are good and right, and you should listen to them and try to understand them, but they're not the final word. And then we have the line that I think that you will especially appreciate. This is chapter 12 and the last half of verse 12. Of making many books there is no end, and much study wearies the body. So yes, the Bible does say that studying too much makes you tired. But still worth doing, in moderation. And then the last word, now that all has been heard, here's the conclusion of the matter: fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil. And that's the final word in Ecclesiastes, this final kind of response. So don't follow these paths of wisdom or do the things that Proverbs says because it's going to give you the good life and it's going to fulfill your purpose in life. Do them because they are the commands of God, and that's the duty of mankind. That's just the right thing to do. That's what's right. Do these things because they are right, and because you know that in the end God is going to judge, that every action will have to have an account given. And so don't do these things because they're going to get all of these great rewards that you expect from these patterns. Do them because they're the right thing to do, and accept the good gifts that God gives along the way in the moment, without trying to latch onto them and hang on to them as the grand scheme of your life. And then that brings us back then to the last book, Job, that we're going to look at. And Job is actually earlier. It comes before Psalms, actually. It's the first of the wisdom books. And I'll slide over here so I'm still in the video. It's possibly the oldest book in the Old Testament. It may have been written even during, like, as far back as the period of the patriarchs, like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, that period. So it's very old, but it's not clear for sure when it was written. And also it's not really clear when Job is supposed to have lived, or even whether Job is supposed to be a historical person or not. It could be that Job is being described as and is a real person that lived in a particular place, and we're given a name of a land called Uz, U-Z, that he lived in. But Uz was very far away from Israel, and none of the other places mentioned, or the cities or towns mentioned as being where people are from in the book, are easy to identify or locate. And so it has this kind of, the opening lines of every Star Wars movie, long ago in a galaxy far, far away. or in a galaxy far away. It's kind of that idea. Long ago in a place far away, this happened. And so then the question is this supposed to be a historical character, that Job is a real person that actually lived, or is he kind of a fictional character being used to present a parable, a teaching or a lesson? Ultimately, the conclusion for the book of Job, the way that you're supposed to come out and understand it, it doesn't really matter whether you think that he's historical or not. You're supposed to take the same lesson. You're supposed to understand the same thing from it. It's a lot like the parables of Jesus in the New Testament. It doesn't really matter whether the characters in the parables are real or not, whether they're actual people or not. They are being presented as an example of a concept or an idea, and you're supposed to learn the idea. And so it doesn't really matter whether the person is real or historical or not. And so same thing with Job. And Job, we're told, is an extremely good man. In fact, he is upright and righteous. He fears God. He makes sacrifices for his children on a regular basis, just in case they have sinned without knowing it. And he wants to make sure that no matter what, his children are covered. Even though his children are also faithful, they have also grown up and they are good kids, good people, good young adults, and they're faithful to God as well. But just in case, Job makes extra sacrifices for his kids to make sure that they are upright and all their sins atoned for. And he lives well, lives wisely. He's just an incredibly good man. And he has received all of the rewards that a reader of the book of Proverbs might expect for him. He has trained his children well in the way they should go, and they have not departed from it in their older age. And so now his children have all grown up. He has lots of them, and they're extremely good. They're good people, and they have good relationships with Job. They live near him and feast with him regularly. And he has done his life, lived his life according to wisdom in his business dealings, and he has become extremely wealthy. And he's been righteous in his dealings with the poor and with all those around him, and he is extremely well loved. All of these people love him because of his actions towards them. And so he has lived according to Proverbs, and he has gotten all of the blessings that you would expect someone who lived according to Proverbs to get. And then we get a scene. The scene shifts. We get this description of Job, and then the scene shifts, and we're being shown inside of the throne room in heaven where God is seated, and he's surrounded by this council of angelic beings that God uses to carry out his will and to govern the universe. And among them is the Satan. The Satan comes, and again, as I mentioned the other day, it came up, Satan, or the Satan, is a title in Hebrew, and it means the accuser. And so this being is coming to accuse the faithful. And Satan comes into the throne room, and God says, "Where have you come from?" And Satan replies, "Going back and forth over the earth, going to and fro on it." And then God says, "Have you considered my servant Job? Look how good he is, how upright he is, how he does all that is good. And he's blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil." And Satan replies and says, "Well, yeah, of course he does. You've given him all of these rewards for all of his good action. And you've put this hedge of protection around him so that nothing can harm him or touch him. Of course he loves you and does what's right. You've made it very rewarding to do so." And then God says, "Okay, if you think that's the only reason that he does it, you can take everything that he has away from him, but you can't harm him directly. You can't harm Job himself, but everything else is fair game. Do as you wish." And then we come back and we see Job, and Job just starts getting these messengers, one after another, after another, after another. And the first comes to him and says, "We were out plowing with the oxen nearby, in the fields nearby, with donkeys grazing nearby. And a group of raiders came and attacked, and they killed off all of the servants, and they stole all of your animals and carried them away. And I am the only one that escaped to come back and tell you." And then while he was still speaking, another comes and says that lightning came down and struck your sheep. All of your herds of sheep and goats were struck, and they've all died, and even the servants that were with them died, and I'm the only one that has escaped to tell you. And then there's another raiding parties came and stole all of his camels and killed all of his servants except for this one who escaped to come and tell you. And then the final blow, a heavy wind, a great wind came and struck your house with all of your children feasting inside it. and your house collapsed, and you've lost your home, and all of your children are dead, and I'm the only servant that has escaped to tell you. And so Job, in just a few minutes, gets word that all of his wealth, all of his worldly possessions, everything that made him wealthy and rich is gone in a moment. And his children and his home are gone as well. His children have died and his home is gone. And the expectation is that Job will turn and curse God for having lost all of these blessings. But instead, Job tears his robe in a sign of grief, and then he falls down and worships God and says, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised." And so Job continues to praise God in spite of his loss. And then we get another scene in the throne room. Satan once again accuses Job. God says, "See, he did not curse me as you expected." And Satan says, "Well, of course he didn't. You haven't taken his health away yet. You've taken away all the stuff around him, but you haven't taken anything from him directly. You haven't taken his own health away yet." And so God says, "Okay, go and strike his body, but you can't kill him. You can do anything to him you want, but you can't kill him." And so Job gets covered in these boiling, blister, painful sores all over his body, and it's so bad he actually takes broken pottery and scrapes his skin to get rid of it, to alleviate the pain for a moment. And his wife, even at this point, turns on him and says, "Are you still trying to hold on to your integrity? Look, just curse God and die. This has gone too far, it's too much. Just go ahead and curse God and get it over with and die." And Job refuses and maintains his integrity, refuses to curse God or speak anything against God. And then there's these three friends that show up, and the three friends are going to spend a lot of the rest of the book accusing Job of doing something wrong. But in their defense, the first thing they do when they show up is they spend a solid week in silence with him, saying nothing, just sitting with him while he grieves. And then at the end of that week, Job speaks up and starts talking about his terrible luck, the way that things have turned against him, and that without actually speaking against God, he says it would be better if I had never been born. And then the three friends start chiming in and telling him that he must have done something wrong. God is just. God would not bring all of this evil on you or let all this evil happen to you unless you had done something very wrong. And so, Job, admit your sin, admit what you did wrong, and confess your fault, and maybe God will relent and give you back some joy in your life. And Job repeatedly says, "No, I'm innocent. I haven't done anything wrong. I didn't sin against God. That's not why this is happening." And of course, we, having seen the throne room scenes in the first two chapters, we know Job is right. This isn't happening because he's done something wrong. It's just happening. God has other reasons, other purposes for allowing this to happen, but it's not because Job has done something wrong. And so this is back and forth over and over and over again throughout the book, until finally Job says something where he challenges God and basically says, if God would just show up and let me defend myself in person, let me tell him about my righteousness, then he would see how good I am and that I did nothing wrong, and then he would relent. And so God does show up. And God tells Job, instead of listening to Job tell about how innocent he is, God tells Job about all the other things that God does in the universe, like making the storms happen and creating the universe, creating the world, setting the boundaries of the seas, creating the storms, creating all the animals and keeping them active and working and making sure that they have food and making sure that they have children and so on. All these things that God keeps working and active all the time. And so Job, it's not that God does not see Job. God sees Job and everything else. And then when God tells all of this to Job, Job's response is, "Oh, oops, I don't really have anything to say to that. I spoke once, but I have no answer, twice, but I will say no more." And then God continues on to tell him about all these other things that are in the universe that he has no idea about, including these two great creatures that are larger than life and more than he could possibly understand, and who could kill a person without even trying, just by accident. All of this is out there. And the conclusion of all of this is basically that there's a lot more going on in the universe than Job can understand. And so Job isn't competent. He isn't wise enough. He doesn't know enough to be able to criticize God's justice. And the end result of this is that Job realizes that God is right, that he can't understand it. And so in humility, he trusts God with whatever happens. And then God gives him a lot of his stuff back, gives him back twice as much as he had before. And so he ends life well, but along the way, he learns this kind of core lesson. The right approach to the stuff of life that happens that we can't understand is humble trust. A realization that we aren't wise enough to understand all that goes on in the universe and all that God does, and to trust God with those things, the stuff we can't understand. That's it. We're over time again. Sorry. And we'll have our last lecture on Friday. See you then.